The gravel crunched under the tires of my battered sedan, a sound that felt like sandpaper against the eerie silence of the valley. I had driven 6 hours from the city, leaving behind a cramped apartment and a job that was slowly draining my soul, to claim an inheritance I hadn't known existed until 3 weeks ago. The letter from the estate attorney had been brief. My great-uncle Silas, a man I hadn't seen since I was 5, had passed away. He was a recluse, a mountain man, as my mother used to say with a roll of her eyes. He had left me his entire estate, 200 acres of pristine shoreline around Blackwood Lake. As I rounded the final bend, I expected to see a rusted gate and an overgrown trail. Instead, I hit a wall of pristine white PVC fencing and a security kiosk that looked like it belonged in a high-end country club. A sign in gold leaf lettering read, "The Shores at Blackwood, a private luxury community." A security guard in a crisp navy uniform stepped out, squinting at my car. "Can I help you, sir? This is a private road." "I'm Elias Thorne," I said, leaning out the window. "I'm here to see the property at the end of the road, the Silas Thorne estate." The guard's expression shifted from professional indifference to visible discomfort. "Mr. Thorne, we weren't expecting you today. You'll need to speak with Mr. Henderson at the sales office." "I don't need a sales pitch," I said, my heart beginning to thump against my ribs. "I own the land." He didn't argue, he just opened the gate with a look that suggested I was heading toward a firing squad. As I drove through the Shores, my jaw dropped. This wasn't just a few cabins, this was a sprawling development. Dozens of multi-million-dollar mountain modern homes sat perched on the hillsides, their floor-to-ceiling glass windows reflecting the lake's deep blue. Manicured lawns replaced the wild ferns I remembered from old photos. There was a clubhouse, a heated infinity pool, and a private marina. The problem was, according to the topographical map sitting on my passenger seat, every single one of these structures was built on my land. I pulled up to the sales office, a glass and timber marvel. Within minutes, I was ushered into the office of Marcus Henderson, a man whose tan was as expensive as his silk tie. He greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Elias, welcome. We've been trying to reach your late uncle for years," Henderson said, gesturing for me to sit. "We assumed the property had been abandoned. Adverse possession, tax liens. We had our legal team look into it. We proceeded with the development under the impression that the title was clearable." "Clearable?" I asked, my voice flat. "My uncle paid the taxes on this land through a trust for 50 years. I have the receipts. You didn't assume it was abandoned. You gambled that no one would show up to claim it." Henderson's smile faltered. "Now, let's be reasonable. We've invested millions into the infrastructure here. We've improved the land value by tenfold. We are prepared to offer you a very generous settlement, $500,000, to sign over the deed and let the homeowners association take full control." I looked out the window at the lake. I thought of Silas, who had lived in a small cabin and refused to sell even a foot of this earth to the timber companies. "My uncle didn't leave me money, Mr. Henderson. He left me a home. You built a playground on top of it." "It's $500,000, Elias," Henderson whispered, his tone turning sharp. "Take it, or we spend the next decade in court. By the time we're done, the legal fees will have eaten every cent you have." "I think I'll take my chances," I said, standing up. The next year was a blur of depositions, dusty archives, and skyrocketing blood pressure. I moved into a small motel in the nearby town, using the modest life insurance policy my uncle had left to fund a legal battle that felt like David versus a very well-dressed Goliath. My lawyer was Sarah Jenkins, a local woman who had a personal grudge against the HOA. They had blocked her father's access to the public boat launch years prior. She was a pit bull in a blazer. "They messed up Elias," Sarah told me one night over a pile of property records. "They relied on a faulty survey from the 1990s and a corrupt county clerk who lost the Thorne Trust filings. But we found the originals in the state archives. They didn't just build on your land, they built the entire infrastructure, the roads, the sewage system, the clubhouse, on property they never owned." The HOA, comprised of the wealthy homeowners who had bought into the dream, began to panic. They weren't just fighting me, they were fighting the fact that their homes were technically illegal trespassers on private soil. The climax came in a humid courtroom in the heat of July. The HOA's legal team, led by a high-priced firm from the city, tried every trick in the book. They argued good faith improvement. They argued that my uncle's lack of presence constituted a waiver of rights. Then, Sarah called their lead surveyor to the stand. "Mr. Vance," Sarah said, leaning against the witness box, "when you conducted the 2021 survey for the HOA, did you notice the stone markers placed by the U.S. Forest Service in 1954? The man shifted. The area was heavily overgrown. We used GPS coordinates. Coordinates that you knew were offset by 30 yards, Sarah countered, slamming a document onto his desk. Because you were told by Mr. Henderson to maximize the buildable square footage, regardless of the boundary, weren't you? The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The surveyor looked at Henderson, who was sweating through his suit, and then back at the judge. He didn't have to answer. His face said it all. The judge's ruling was a sledgehammer. He didn't just find in my favor. He issued a scathing rebuke of the HOA's predatory and negligent development practices. Because the HOA had knowingly bypassed proper title searches and ignored the Thorn Trust markers, the judge ruled that the structures were a permanent trespass. He awarded me damages for the destruction of the natural landscape, but more importantly, he ruled that the HOA was responsible for the full restoration of the property or a buyout at the current market value of the developed land, plus punitive damages. The final figure hit the news like a lightning bolt, $8.2 million. But the money wasn't the victory. The victory was the meeting that followed. I sat in the clubhouse, the building that legally belonged to me now, facing the board of the HOA. These were people who had looked down their noses at me for months. Now, they looked like they were attending a funeral. "We can't pay it," one woman sobbed. "The HOA fees would have to be tripled. We'll lose our homes." I looked at them. I saw the greed that had started this. But I also saw families who had been lied to by Marcus Henderson and his developers. "I'm not going to take your homes," I said, my voice quiet but firm. The room went silent. "But here is what is going to happen," I continued. "The HOA is going to dissolve. The gates come down. The white fences come down. This lake is no longer private. It's going back to the public, just like my uncle always wanted." I laid out the terms Sarah and I had drafted. I would use $4 million of the settlement to establish the Sealer's Thorn Conservation Trust. This trust would take ownership of the shoreline, the marina, and the clubhouse. The clubhouse would become a public nature center. The roads would be turned over to the county. The remaining $4.2 million would be paid by the developer's insurance and the HOA's reserve funds. I would keep enough to rebuild my uncle's cabin on the far side of the lake, far away from the glass mansions. "You're giving up the money?" Henderson asked, looking at me like I was insane. "I'm keeping enough to live," I said. "The rest is for the lake. You spent $8 million trying to wall off a piece of the world that didn't belong to you. I'm spending it to open it back up." 6 months later, the transformation began. The security kiosk was hauled away on a flatbed truck. A new sign was erected at the entrance, made of rough-hewn cedar, Blackwood Lake Public Preserve. I stood on the porch of my new cabin, a modest place built with the same footprint as Sealer's original home. The sound of children laughing drifted across the water from the old private beach, which was now filled with local families holding picnics. The HOA had lost $8 million in court, but the valley had gained its soul back. I sat down in an old wooden rocker, the same one Sealer's used to sit in, and watched the sun dip below the pines. The water was still, a perfect mirror of the sky. I had inherited a massive estate, and for a moment the world had tried to turn it into a cage. But in the end the land stayed wild, and I finally understood why my uncle had never left. You don't own a place like this. You just look after it until the next person comes along, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I belonged. The lake was quiet again, the way it was always meant to be. I breathed in the scent of pine and damp earth, closed my eyes, and listened to the sound of the wind moving through the trees, a sound that no amount of money could ever buy, and no HOA could ever truly own. I had won the war not by keeping the wealth, but by giving the land its freedom. And as the stars began to reflect in the deep, dark water of Blackwood Lake, I knew Sealer's would have been proud.